Hello and welcome to section 2 of chapter 20 of the American pageant. We're looking at the decisiveness of diplomacy to the crushed cotton kingdom. We're looking at how the Civil War gets going. Kind of look at the economic and the cultural side of the Civil War, arguably the most important event in American history. So a couple things. Remember, the South were trying to use King Cotton or cotton diplomacy to get allies to beat the North in the Civil War. And so there's some issues with foreign policy going on for President Lincoln. You have the Trent Affair, which occurs in late 1861. This is far into the war happening. A Union warship stopped a British mail steamer called the Trent and removed two Confederate diplomats who were heading to Europe. And so they stopped a British ship, removed two Confederates. The British started sending troops to Canada in retaliation because we violated their rights and all that kind of stuff. But the situation was resolved. Lincoln, he said basically one war at a time, boys. He freed the Confederate prisoners and kind of allowed them to go about their business. But this was a very cautious thing for the North. They had to tiptoe around not provoking Britain and France into the war. Canada actually became a staging ground for a few southern attacks from the northern border into the northern territories. British shipyards were producing, that's a really big word, I can't say it, producing Confederate commerce raiders. They were producing ships for the South. Serendipity is probably what it's going to be about. I don't think so, though. That's a tough word. The British ships left their ports unarmed. They pick up guns elsewhere, and then they're captured by Union ships. Once they become Confederate ships, and they have the Confederate flag, they could be captured. One notable ship was the Alabama, which acted as a pirate ship. It attacked northern merchant ships. The British attempted to end this practice in 1863. Once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Britain really tries to stay out because they'd already banned slavery. These types of ships seized 250 ships, hurt commerce, and just kind of disrupted the northern flow of goods. This is a political cartoons of the pending conflict, 1863. You see the South with their pirate, the Alabama, fighting the North. And you have Britain and France here in the background enjoying it and handing them sticks, going, here you go, have fun, beating on the United States. In 1863, two Confederate Laird rams were being built by the British in a shipyard. To avoid infuriating the North, potentially starting a war, the London government bought these ships for the Royal Navy instead of turning them over to the South. Remember, the South doesn't have much of a navy. Most of the navy stays loyal to the North. Britain does establish the Dominion of Canada in 1867, which was partially designed to strengthen Canadians against the possible vengeance from the United States for some of the attacks stemming from Canada. Then you have Emperor Napoleon III of France, who installed a French government in Mexico City in 1863. Maximilian, pictured here, was the French Emperor of Mexico City. These actions were in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, but because the North is so busy with the Civil War, they kind of let it go. Napoleon hoped that the Union would not retaliate due to its weakness fighting the Civil War. He was correct. America did aid Benito Juarez to fight against Maximilian and Napoleon, their allies here. Civil War ends in 1865. America threatened to invade Mexico. Napoleon was forced to abandon Maximilian in Mexico City. In fact, the Mexicans kicked out the French at the Battle of Puebla in May 5th, 1870, which is commemorated in America and in Mexico, Cinco de Mayo. It's not Mexican Independence Day. It's not really a big holiday in Mexico either, but in America, it's a way to celebrate Mexican culture, which is awesome. So you got President Davis versus President Lincoln. One of the defects of the South's Constitution was its own states could secede from the South. States' rights were so important to them that it actually hurt, the Southern cause because they couldn't work together. They didn't allow President Davis to kind of rule and kind of bend the rules to win the war. Some state troops refused to serve outside of their borders. We're only fighting in Alabama. We're only fighting in Mississippi. President Jeff Davis and the Confederacy often had disputes within their own Congress. Davis had the task as president proved beyond his powers. Even though he's elected to a 6-year term, had a line item veto, he couldn't handle it. There was too much infighting in the South. Lincoln in the North enjoyed a long-established government. It was financially stable. It was fully recognized at home and abroad. So they didn't have to worry about trade and diplomacy and all that stuff. Lincoln was more decisive. He also immersed himself in the theories of war. When the war broke out, Lincoln, kind of holed up at the War Department and just studied war and tactics and history of war, and so he could be versed in it when he talked to his commanders. This is a picture of him at the Battle of Antietam in 1862. This is Alan Pinkerton here from Pinkerton's Detectives, and General John McClellan right here. Pretty famous picture of Lincoln. Because Congress was not in session when the war started, Lincoln took a lot of actions normally that had to be approved by Congress. One, he initiated the blockade. Two, he increased the size of the federal army. Congress wasn't due to meet for months when the war broke out, so Lincoln said, hey, you're not here, I'm going to take care of it, and I'm going to get this really radical, punk rock haircut going on here, too. I'm not sure what Lincoln's doing right here. He directed the Secretary of Treasury, Solomon Chase, to advance $2 million without appropriation or security to 3 private citizens for military purposes. He suspended writ of habeas corpus, which is the right to a free trial, basically. Basically, a citizen could be held without a trial because he was doing it for national security. The Supreme Court overruled him and said you can't do that, and he said, let's see them enforce it. He held supervised voting in border states and hey, make sure you're doing this right and vote Republican. He suspended some newspapers. He had the editors arrested. He did all these things to save the Union. So it's kind of funny, to save the Constitution and our freedoms we hold dear, he took away a lot of them temporarily. Also in 1862, the Confederates, desperate for men, instituted the first draft in American history. All men ages 18 to 35 were eligible. Back then, you could hire a sub. I'm busy, I'm building a deck, and Joe over here is going to do it for me. I paid him. Plantation owners with more than 20 slaves could get out of the war, too. So the old adage that it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight is certainly true for the Civil War. The North offered bounties. Basically, if you sign up, we'll give you, $50 cash. And so people would sign up, get the cash, and then jump to another state and sign up for them and sign up, get $50 cash. They're called bounty jumpers. The North held its first draft in March 1863. All men eligible were ages 20 to 45. You could hire a sub in the North, or you could just pay $300 and not go. It's just not a good time for me. Here's $300. Which led to more bounty brokers. They would go hire people. They hire substitutes. This was a whole burgeoning industry, and more bounty jumpers. In reaction to this, Irish mobs looted the city of New York for days in the New York draft riots in July 1863. Sadly, tragically, they lynched African Americans in the streets, pictured here. Over 100 people were killed. They had to call on federal troops to crush this and fire into the crowds of the angry mobs who were attacking and looting big businesses and rich people. This is a political cartoon from it. It also was immortalized in the movie The Gangs of New York by Martin Scorsese. Here's a picture from it. Scorsese took it a little further than what actually happened. I'm not sure there was actually cannons being fired into New York City. But hey, it makes good for good movies. This is just a random picture. It's a leg amputation in Virginia. The surgeon here is getting ready to cut off the leg. It's been wounded. This guy has a tourniquet. The gentleman looking at you right here is holding a sponge with chloroform to the poor patient's mouth to pass them out and kill the pain. It's estimated that 30% of amputees died, possibly from disease and other issues like that. And you also got some fancy pajama pants here. These uniforms were popular in both the North and the South. This is the number of men in uniform and the date given. You can see that when the war started, the Union, the North had 186,000, Confederates had 112,000. And then as it advanced, you can see that it jumps all the way up to 500,000, to almost to nearly 1 million. A little bit of decline in 1864, but then back up to 959,000. The South, the Confederacy, never had that big of an army compared to the North. They're always outnumbered, and so they have to use their wits, their commanders, and their better training to try to outduel the North and outlast them. Money-wise, the North increased tariffs and increased excise taxes to help pay for the war. It also created the first income tax in American history, which was later struck down by the Supreme Court. That's why they had to pass the 16th Amendment. Congress passed the Morrill Tariff Act of 1861, which was a high protective tariff, a tax on imports that increased duties by 5 to 10%, which the South's not there to bicker about it anymore because they always felt the tariffs hurt them. So the North can protect its industries, its factories. It was designed to raise additional revenue and also provide protection for those factories in the North. Washington started issuing paper money. Some of them are pictured here, a $20 note, $10 note. The greenback currency was not backed by gold, but by credit, which is the basis of our financial system today, but led to inflation and a lot of problems. The value was constantly changing. It wasn't reliable. Congress in 1863 established the national banking system, which was designed to stimulate the sale of government bonds and establish a standard currency. Remember, the whole Bank of the United States was destroyed by Andrew Jackson, and this is before the Federal Reserve. And so it's kind of got a lot of pet banks, a lot of just kind of wild banks out there, wildcat banks as they're called, doing their thing. Banks who joined the national banking system could buy government bonds and issue paper money that was backed by those bonds. And so once again, based on credit, not gold. Not as bad as the South. Confederate government also issued bonds, raised taxes, and issued their own money. They were forced to print blue-backed paper money that was subject to runaway inflation. It was so bad, and people invested in it, they lost everything. If you go on eBay, you can find Confederate money. They printed so much of it. It's not very expensive, and you can find these historic relics on eBay and other sites on the internet. When Lee surrendered, $1 was worth 1.6 cents in the Confederacy. Oops. Not as bad as Nazi Germany, or pre-Nazi Germany, I should say, Weimar Germany. 9,000% inflation rate in the South. Inflation in the North was bad too, 80%, but there was food riots in the South because of this, in Atlanta specifically. And then this causes an economic boom. The big government contracts, the amount of manufacturing and stuff going on in the North helps the North get rich, and from that it causes a second industrial revolution. The newly invented labor-saving machinery enabled the North to expand economically with those government contracts, with that government money being fused into their businesses. Mechanical reapers allowed men to leave the farms to go fight because they could harvest the crops. It increased the harvesting capacity. Many made fortunes from the government contracts to supply the military. Petroleum was actually, or drilling for oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, which led to a rush of people to Pennsylvania to drill oil derricks. Or 59ers. That's why we have Quaker State, Pennzoil, all that fun stuff. And then in 1862, without the South to object, they passed the Homestead Act, which we'll talk later in chapters about the westward expansion, which gave free land to people. Like, hey, we got free land. Don't tell anyone it's the Native Americans. Oh well. Women did take over men's jobs. It's kind of a theme of war, especially in a total war. And so women at home were running the family farm. They worked in factories. Some actually went and fought for freedom, including Charlotte Brown. Many helped the army. They rolled bandages. They wove blankets. They collected supplies. They made ammunition. Sadly, there were 78 women killed in an explosion in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, in an ammunition plant. Southerners witnessed first on women the war directly. Plantation women now had to oversee the slaves during the fighting. Many pleaded with the men to come home, which led to higher desertion rates in the South than the North, because you'd think the South having something a little more of a cause to fight for their own country instead of a union or a constitution. But because the war was in the South and the hardships from the South and the blockade was affecting the South, there's higher desertion, which means men leaving their units, leaving the army and going home to check in on their families. There's also spies. Harriet Tubman was a spy. Rose O'Neill Greenhow was a Southern spy. There was Southern women that were promiscuous and like to hang out in Washington, D.C. with some of the leading military men and learned bedside secrets of what's going on. The U.S. Sanitary Commission was organized by women to provide medical support for the Union armies. You have Dorothy Dix, you have Sally Tompkins, Mary Ann Bickerdike, and then pictured here Clara Barton, who worked during the war, and eventually she founds the Red Cross, which is still around today, kind of a big deal. Good job, Clara Barton. This is from a sanitation fair in Chicago. These were souvenirs that were sold. Basically, these fairs were held to raise funds for the soldiers. They sold knickknacks and homemade goods. They raised $100,000 for the troops in their money. And so this was any holder but a slave holder. These are pot holders that were woven by northern women. This is a booth here for them trying to raise money. They even sold an original copy of the Emancipation Proclamation for $3,000. And so this happened in Chicago in 1863. So the North, their blockade severely hampered the South economy. That Cotton Kingdom failed. It backfired miserably. The North, or the South, doesn't get the aid from Britain and France. They also lose out on selling goods to those countries because they withhold their cotton in hopes of recognition and aid. They shoot themselves in the foot. Britain and France get their cotton from elsewhere. Britain gets it specifically from Egypt and eventually India. And so not only are they're not getting help from England and France, they're also not making money from their cotton sales. 30% of the nation's wealth in 1860 was held by the South. By 1870, you only have 12%. Those blockades, and you could argue the Navy really wins the war for the South, for the North. Transportation in the South collapsed during the Civil War. They don't have reliable transportation, not like the North with the railways. They're more dependent on waterways in the South. They tore up their rails for military supplies. They needed the metal to make guns and cannons and ammunition. They don't have the big factories like the North did. Cotton capitalism lost out to industrial capitalism. The factories of the North also contribute to the victory. That's all I have for now. Thank you. If you have any questions, let me know.